Okay, let's look at this top hit on YouTube. When you type in debt ceiling, this is the top video by Vox on explaining the debt ceiling. I want to react to this. Let's go.
These grades aren't for students. They're for businesses, based on how likely the company is to pay its debts back. A company like Microsoft has the best grade possible, AAA, since they have a long history of paying people on time.
The internet is about driving profitability.
But a newer company like Tesla has a BB rating.
Fundamentally change the equation. You've got to have an all-electric vehicle.
And that affects their interest rates. Microsoft pays its investors 2.5% interest. Tesla pays a bit more at 5.3%.
I guess I'm a little confused about this. First, are they talking about what they have to pay investors, or are they talking about what they have to pay banks? Is this what a bank charges them, or what's expected to be paid back? But in any case, I see that this is a credit rating. Same way you and I might have a FICO score or something that basically is determining how much money should be charged to loan money due to the risk involved. Sure.
The riskier the grade, the higher the interest rate. But it's not just companies that have grades. Countries do too.
Countries
The United
do too.
States, for a really long time, had a AAA rating until
Lawmakers have just 2 more days to raise the nation's debt ceiling and avoid a catastrophic
default on its loans, which could
default on its loans. So governments that create their own currency can't default on their loans unless they choose to. So the United States is an example of a government that creates US dollars. Only the United States government can create United States dollars. Only the Canadian government can create Canadian dollars, and only the, Japanese government can create yen. So we're already setting up for a fallacy here, because the only reason, and maybe maybe it's not setting up for a fallacy, maybe this is what the video is going to get into. The only reason that a government that creates its own money can't pay bills in its own money is if the policymakers within the government just decide not to.
could create turmoil in the U.S. economy and worldwide.
the U.S. has a weird thing called the debt ceiling, which is just
They're right on this. There's no other country on earth that has a debt ceiling. This is an entirely U.S. phenomenon.
a limit on how much debt the country can take on. If the national debt reaches that limit, the U.S. might not be able to pay its investors. The U.S. regularly comes close to hitting it, but
Okay, so let me go back here. I want to hear that again.
the U.S. has a weird thing called the debt ceiling.
Yep, weird thing called
which
debt
is
ceiling.
just a limit on how much debt the country can take on.
So, okay, stop right there. The country doesn't take on any debt. So, again, going back to the fact that the government creates its own money, right? If a nation has the ability to create its own money, there's no other place to get the money from. So there's this idea that the United States government has to either tax money or borrow money from outside sources in order to pay for things, but that fundamentally doesn't make any sense, because the only place that can create dollars to begin with is the U.S. government. And I know there's a conversation to be had about the Federal Reserve and whether or not that's private or whether or not that's public. Turns out that it's public. You can watch another video on that. But the dollars have to come from somewhere. And if nobody made the dollars in the first place, where would they be to tax, or where would they be to borrow? So the fact that the U.S. government would go into debt is already not logically viable. I'll get into more. I have a feeling I'm going to get into more of why that's the case here as this video goes on.
If the national debt reaches that limit, the U.S. might not be able to pay its investors.
So the debt ceiling is this entirely, I'm guessing the video is going to go into this, it's this entirely arbitrary number that Congress comes up with, where they say, okay, we're not going to spend, have the national debt go above 30 trillion or whatever it is. And the point this video is making is that, okay, if the government spending goes up to a point where it starts hitting that debt ceiling, it, in quotes, won't be able to pay its investors. Well, the video kind of admits this. I don't know if it does so knowingly, that it's a weird thing that's an arbitrary choice. So it's not that they won't be able to pay the investors, it's that they're choosing not to pay the investors because they've created this arbitrary thing called a debt ceiling. And again, there are no investors. There are no investors. Because again, where would the investors get the dollars from if the United States government didn't get them to begin with? More on that later.
The U.S. regularly comes close to hitting it, but the government always ends up raising it.
Because it's arbitrary.
Until 2011, when it almost didn't. After that, the U.S. was downgraded for the first time due to, quote, political risks. Since then...
So there's two things that come out of my mouth at the same time on this. So first of all, the idea that governments that create their own money, again, there are governments out there that don't create their own money. For example, governments within the European Eurozone. There's the European Central Bank that creates the money in a weird relationship between them and the EU. But the idea that you should have a credit risk on a government that creates its own money is just stupid. It doesn't make any sense. However, there is the point that if the government arbitrarily decides to say, okay, we've made this arbitrary number called the debt ceiling where we agree that we're not going to pay more money beyond that debt ceiling just because that's the number that we pick, then I guess there is a risk of things not getting paid.
Congress and the president have had to raise it 7 more times. It's becoming an almost annual task. And of course, it always goes super swell.
The entire basis of the Republican strategy is we're going to shut down the government or cause economic chaos if we don't get 100% of what we want.
This isn't some damn game.
My Republican friends need to stop playing Russian roulette.
Russian roulette with the economy.
In the last...
Okay, that's worth pointing out. Obama was totally right there. Now, not that I agree with whatever policy that he was or wasn't trying to push, is that typically, because the government can create its own money, and whether or not people in Congress fully grasp that is up for debate, but because the United States can create its own money, if any part of the federal government, particularly within Congress in this case, argues over, hey, we don't have the budget for this thing or that thing that you're doing, that's just a complete fallacy. And you'll notice that whatever party is typically not in power, this has nothing to do with like Republicans, ostensibly being fiscal conservatives and Democrats being heavy spenders. They're all heavy spenders. It has to do with the fact that whatever party's not in power brings up the national debt as, oh my God, we can't afford it. I mean, this is what the Democrats did during the Trump administration for building the wall, is we can't afford that. Where are we going to get this money from? Because they know, both sides know, that it's actually not a matter of whether or not we can afford it, but because everybody believes that can be trudged up as a reason to bring resistance to the other side of the political aisle. And what was it Obama that said holding? Let me hear what Obama said again.
Always goes super swell.
The entire basis of the Republican strategy is we're going to shut down the government or cause economic chaos if we...
Yeah, I mean, that's what's been happening, I guess, almost every year since this press release has gone out from Obama. And, I was even seeing this in the state of Oregon. I've got business interests in the state of Oregon that are actually affected by legislative changes. And the Republicans did this in the state of Oregon is there was a huge amount of funding that was about to not get paid out in the state of Oregon because all the Republicans walked off and in order to not give the legislature a quorum to pass what the Democrats wanted. Now in the state of Oregon, there's it's a completely all three parts of all three legs of the stool are Democrat: the House, the Senate, and the governor. And one of the big things that the Republicans were fighting against were the transgender stuff in schools where, kids can supposedly change their gender without parents' consent and that sort of thing. And because the Republicans are completely the minority in all governing aspects in the state of Oregon, they have found out that the only way they can get the Democrats to come to the table is to get up and leave. Now, what's interesting about this is that, again, none of this is like an economic decision. And by the way, the Republicans did achieve victory there. And I was actually sweating bullets because there was something I wanted funded that affected me directly. But what I realized is that there was kind of like the base funding and the things that the Republicans and the Democrats were fighting about. And I think both sides know is they can't stop the base funding because the whole state would fall apart. So I realized that they were going to come to the table at the 11th hour. And then when they did come to the table at the 11th hour, they defeated this transgender thing, the Republican side. I don't know what concessions they had to give for it, but the emphasis here is that these are entirely political decisions. These are entirely political moves. So Obama has a completely good point here that either side of the aisle has the ability to threaten economic chaos in order to get what they want politically.
If we don't get 100% of what we want.
This isn't some damn game.
My Republican friends need to stop playing Russian roulette.
Russian roulette with the economy.
In the last 20 years, the U.S. has borrowed more and more money.
No, they haven't. Who would they borrow it from? There's one place that dollars can originate from. That's the federal United States government. Where would they borrow it from? I mean, think about it. Let's say I'm a sovereign nation. Dylan Moore, I'm a sovereign nation, and I've got a printer right here. I don't know if you can see it on that side. I got a printer right here where I can print out as much money as I want at any given moment. And you come to me and you say, hey, I need a job. And I'm like, okay, great. You work for me. I'll print out $100. There you go. And then a week goes by after I pay you, and I'm like, hey, man, I'm kind of hurting on money. Can I borrow that $100? Well, I've got this infinite money printer sitting right next to me. That doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense at all. So no, the government has not gone more and more into debt.
The national debt is at an all-time high. But how should we feel about this debt?
Yeah, who owns this? Good point.
What
Who owns
happens
the
if
debt?
we don't pay it back? The U.S. national debt is nearing $29 trillion with a capital T.
29
Depending on when you watch this,
See,
it might.
No one can actually give an argument why that number's too high. So the only way that you can scare people about it is to have like this really emotional voice when you say that 29 trillion. Oh my God, it's 30 trillion. What's it up to now? 33 trillion? It's 33 trillion. This is unsustainable. Why? Why is that? How do you know what particular number or another is unsustainable?
Might already be there. It's best not to look at it as a number, but instead as a comparison to the size of the economy. You'll see the U.S. takes on more debt when the country spends a lot, because of wars or because of investments needed during recessions and now pandemics. And the department in charge of all this is the U.S. Treasury. They collect taxes and spend them to fund the government.
Nope. Error. They spend the money into existence and then they collect the taxes. So this is why I wanted to respond to this. This is the I don't know if it's the common fundamental error of economics, but it's one of them, is that the government does not tax in order to spend. The state of Oregon does, because the state of Oregon can't create money out of thin air. Any state, any county, any city, they need to tax in order to spend. However, the federal government does not, because the federal government has to create the money in the first place. I will address this now because if this is the first time you're hearing something like this, I'm sure what I'm saying sounds like absolute heresy and gobbledygook, because you might point to the fact and say, look, there is a national debt. I'm going to make my screen bigger here. You can say, look, there is a national debt. Well, it's 29 trillion as of October 2021 or whatever that was. And the word debt is really a misnomer. In a certain aspect, it's a debt, but it's not the same as a debt to you and me. So if I go into debt, I get a car loan, I get a house loan, I get a loan from the mafia or whatever, right? I have to go out, I borrow dollars, and I need to pay those dollars back. I need to go out and somehow acquire the dollars in order to pay them back. I am a currency user. The federal government is not a currency user. It is a currency issuer. It does not have the same requirements in order to, in quotes, pay its debts. So now, what is a debt then to the federal government? Again, in dollars. If the federal government creates a treasury bond. If there's a bond from the treasury, people think that that's the government borrowing money. Where the government comes out and says, look, I will give you treasuries with a promise to pay more money in the future, 5% or 2% or whatever the interest rate is right now, in exchange for reserves right now. Then I could take those reserves and go and spend them. And people say, well, this kicks the can down the road because you're just getting big, getting more and more loans to pay off past loans, and it's increasing the interest rate and you can never catch up. That would be true if it were the private sector, but it's completely different for the issuer of the currency. In reality, the proper way to look at this is that a reserve and a treasury bond are both money. One doesn't pay interest. The reserve doesn't pay interest. The treasury bond does. The easiest way to think about this is that a reserve is like money in your checking account. A bond is like money in your savings account, and that savings account pays interest. Follow me here? So at the Federal Reserve, which is the government organization tasked for keeping track of this balance sheet, essentially, when they have a treasury bond, mature, that's the word I'm looking for, it's not like they have to go find reserves from somewhere. And there's like people running around with wheelbarrows of money moving it around back and forth. All it is okay, this 5% bond for $100 just matured, so debit $100 from the treasury side of this guy's account and credit $105 to the reserve side of the account. You see that? It's just a push of a button. And because there's nothing limiting the federal government from creating however many bonds or however many reserves as it wants to, all this is sloshing securities around back and forth. And once you understand that a treasury bond, is just another form of money that pays an interest rate, then you recognize that this isn't really it. I mean, it's a debt in the sense that the government made a promise that they're going to give you reserves in exchange for your treasury bond at some point in the future. But it's not the debt in the sense that the government has to go, oh my God, where are we going to get the reserves to pay for this? Let's run around and tax and borrow and blah, blah. It's not that. It's just not that, which turns this whole debt ceiling thing, this whole national debt thing, into just inane nonsense. Just complete distraction. The national debt isn't a measure of how much debt the U.S. government has. It's just a measure of how many interest-bearing treasury bonds are out there for people to collect interest on. Risk-free interest at that.
And for the record, it's Congress and the president who decide how much taxes should be and where the money should be spent.
Correct.
The Treasury just handles the flow of money.
Correct.
But for essentially ever, they approve more spending than they bring in with taxes. So the Treasury has to...
They have to approve more spending than they bring in taxes. This is like the upside down nature of the description of the economy versus how it actually works. So think about this. If the government needs to create the money first, in order for there to be money to begin with, unless somebody creates it, it's not there. Does that make sense? Like in ancient Greece, did U.S. dollars exist? No. Right? No one could tax U.S. dollars in ancient Greece because the United States government didn't exist yet. At some point, the United States government had to come into being, and the United States government had to create money. The way money is created is it gets spent into existence. Once it's spent into existence, it can be taxed out of the system later. And if you read people or watch videos from people like Warren Mosler, who's kind of a founding guy when he comes to understanding how the flow of money creation and taxation works, is he used to work in bond markets, and he noticed that when it comes to these fiscal flows of going out and coming in, that the actual functioning, the actual mechanism of the financial system, the money goes out from the government first and it gets taxed in second, right? That's the evidence to back up what I'm saying, right? So if the government spends more than it taxes, it's leaving money in the private sector to save and to use as the private sector. Does that make sense? If I spend $10 into existence and I tax $5 out, there's $5 left for the private sector to use. Now, if I spend $5 into existence and I tax $10 out, I'm actually removing currency from the private sector. So in order for the private sector to even have currency to begin with, to function, to have an economy to function, the government has to spend more than it taxes out. I know this is weird if you've heard this for the first time, but once you understand how the economy works, videos like this start seeming really stupid.
To make up that difference by taking on debt. And it does that by selling bonds. They can vary, but generally it works like this. You buy a $1,000 30-year bond at a locked-in 2% interest rate. Every year, the Treasury sends you $20, the 2% interest you've earned. And after 30 years, you can cash out the bond and get your $1,000 back. It's a win-win situation. The U.S. gets money to fund the government, and you make some profit.
The U.S. does not get money to fund the government. The U.S. does not get money to fund the government. The United States can fund itself because it's a sovereign issuer of the currency. And you know this is true because where else would the dollars come from? There's only one place they can come from, the federal government.
Fit on a safe investment. More than a third of these bonds, and therefore the total U.S. debt, are owned by Americans and American companies, investors, and also banks, local government.
Again, it's not correct. I mean, at some level, it's kind of a debt because, again, the government has a promise to pay this interest rate. But it's not like you own debt, right? It's not like I've got a promissory note from somebody who owes me money. It's not the same thing.
And even pension funds keep their money in bonds. And the largest part is owned by the federal government. Yes, the federal government owns part of the federal government's debt. The money for Social Security.
Right. So you heard that record scratch? Like, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. It's because that doesn't make any sense. The United States government does not own its own debt. All right? These are just numbers moving around on the screen within the government. It's not actually debt. They're both money. Okay? Reserves and treasury bonds are both money. One pays interest, the other one doesn't. It's that simple.
Security is actually kept in bonds. So is the money for Medicare and federal pensions. The Federal Reserve has bonds too. Foreign investors only own a quarter of the U.S. debt. And while Chinese investors used to have the largest share, Japanese investors actually own more now.
Yeah, again, Japan and China don't own the United States debt. This is what's happening. Japan and China are net export countries. So Japan and China make stuff in Japan and China, and then they sell it to the United States. When they sell it to the United States, they take the thing that they made in their respective countries and they exchange it for US dollars. Now, once the US dollars go to Japan or once the US dollars go to China, what happens is the holders of those dollars say, you know what? I might as well get a risk-free interest rate while I'm holding this. Because why wouldn't you? Hey, right now, the Federal Reserve is offering, 4.5%, 5% on Treasury bonds. Shit, I can get 5%. That's it. There's no debt. And there's also this idea of, what if China or what if Japan calls the debt due? Call what debt due? What are you talking about, right? Are you suggesting that China or Japan start selling their treasury bonds on the open market? Because when you sell the bonds, you're not getting the same price that you would get if you simply sat there and waited for the bonds to mature. You're going to get some sort of discount for them. And if they've got trillions, and I believe they got trillions. Is this thing going to say how much?
They own around 4.
Yeah, it's just in percentages. I believe they have trillions that they're going to turn around and dump those on the open market and drive down the value of their own investments. No. They've done business with the United States, they've gotten dollars, and they have exchanged them for a different type of dollar called a treasury bond that pays an interest rate. That's it.
25% of all U.S. debt. And it is a lot of debt. Of all the developed countries, the U.S. has the fourth largest debt compared to the size
look
of
at
the
these
economy.
countries. Oh my God. I remember some tweet from years and years ago of some guy going, okay, how are all these countries in debt? Who are they in debt to? The Decepticons? Like aliens? Like who? If everybody's in debt, who's holding this money? It's because it's not actually debt. Okay, maybe. Let's look at some of these countries. I don't know enough about Estonia, but I do know Luxembourg uses the euro. So the Luxembourg actually is in debt because Luxembourg can't create euros. Turkey makes its own money. Switzerland makes its own money. I don't know about Chile. Czech Republic. Can't, back when I went there when I was 11, they were using crowns. I don't know if they're on the euro yet or if they're still using crowns. Don't know about Norway, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, Mexico. Mexico's on its own peso. It can't be in debt in its own money. Sweden, I don't know. Germany is in debt because Germany is on the euro and can't pay, can't just create that money out of thin air. Kind of. The euro is a weird zone because it's, they can kind of create it, but they kind of can't. Ireland creates its own money. The Netherlands is on the euro. It's actually in debt. I believe Israel creates its own money. I believe Poland creates its own money. I think Slovakia is on the euro, so it's actually in debt. I believe Finland creates its own money. Colombia, don't know. Australia creates its own money for sure. Hungary, last I checked, the forint that creates its own money. Slovenia is on the euro, so that's actually in debt. Austria is on the euro, that's actually in debt. Canada creates its own money, it can't be in debt. Belgium's on the euro. France is on the euro. Spain, I'm pretty sure, is on the euro. The United Kingdom creates its own money, can't actually be in debt. Portugal, pretty sure, is on the euro. The United States, obviously, we're talking about that. Italy's on the euro, Greece is on the euro, and Japan, again, creates its own money out of thin air, can't actually be in debt to itself.
Economy. So is this bad?
I was actually hoping it would pop up something like Argentina or Ecuador because there's a lot of countries that make the U.S. dollar their official currency of account. They're actually in debt because Ecuador has to go find U.S. dollars in order to pay its U.S. dollars off. It can't create the U.S. dollars out of nothing.
Really, really frustrating answer is we don't know.
Debt has pros and cons. One question is, what are you doing with the debt?
When you're in an economic recession or an emergency, not only should you borrow, you should borrow a lot. But what you shouldn't do is borrow when your economy is strong and the political inconvenience.
Yeah, see, so when you think of it as borrowing, you just come up with nonsense. So she's saying when the economy's weak, you need to borrow to get it moving again, but when the economy's strong, you want to stop borrowing. Because it's not borrowing, what you need to understand is that unemployment is actually a result of taxation. Did you know that? That when a government demands a tax, it's done in an arbitrary token, right? US dollars are an arbitrary token. Canadian dollars are an arbitrary token. Japanese yen are an arbitrary token. When the government demands a tax in an arbitrary token, you've just become unemployed, right? Because, I mean, if you get a job and you get paid, what do you get paid in? You get paid in the unit of account within that country, right? If I get a job in the United States, everybody knows I'm making dollars. If I get a job in Germany, everybody knows I'm making euros. If I get a job in Japan, everybody knows I'm making yen. You get paid in the unit of account. So when the government says, you owe me a tax, suddenly you're unemployed. So it's your job to go find a job in order to get the money in order to pay that tax. Now, because the government is creating the unemployment by demanding the tax, it follows that the government has a duty to continue to provide you the means of getting that tax. And there's, I'm sure people listening to this are going, well, what about inflation? What about inflation? That's a big topic. But I do want to say this about inflation is that as long as productive capacity is not being reached by either employment measures or unemployment measures, or by, just think of a factory that says, okay, we can create 1,000 units a day, but right now we only got people buying 500. As long as productive capacity hasn't been reached, when you're putting more money into the system by spending more money into the system, you're not bidding up a limited number of resources. You're actually giving the economy the money it needs to buy the remaining resources, in quotes, off the shelves. So when you get in a situation where, okay, if enough money has been spent into existence that Okay, everybody's employed and all the factories are producing at 100%. Now you're throwing more money at a limited number of goods, which would create the inflation. However, as long as there is an unemployed part of the population, you can essentially assume that not enough money has been spent into existence by the federal government. So this whole thing about, you got to borrow when it's weak, but you got to stop borrowing, it's just total nonsense. It's just complete nonsense.
Into paying for things is too high.
Another really important question is, what are interest rates? In recent years, interest rates have been very low. That tends to make it easier to borrow and to sustain that borrowing.
This is also incorrect. So the traditional thinking is that, actually, let me back up one more step. Interest rates set by the Federal Reserve are an entirely political decision. It has nothing to do with the economy. I mean, maybe they think they're thinking about the economy when they make the decision, but when they make the decision, it's entirely political. That they could say whatever number they want, regardless of whatever the economy is doing, and that's the decision that they get to make. Now, what this guy just said is that it's easier to borrow, or you see more borrowing, I think he said both, when the interest rates are lower. Now, it turns out that that's not actually true. Now, or I should say this. It turns out when you look at the empirical data that the thing that slows down or speeds up borrowing almost has nothing to do with the interest rate. What slows down or speeds up borrowing is the number of ready and willing borrowers. And that typically what we see is that the interest rates go up, more money is borrowed, and as interest rates go down, less money is borrowed. I know this is counterintuitive, but this is what the empirical data shows, and the interpretation, at least from the crowds that I'm listening to, is that the Federal Reserve is usually behind the eight ball. That when an economic shift happens, and the economy goes in this way or that way, by the time that they change the interest rate, they're kind of too late to catch up with it. And ultimately, the only thing that the interest rate does is you're paying free money on money. It's kind of a universal basic income for the rich. So as the interest rates go up and up and up, I mean, right now they're 5% or whatever, I could turn around and make 5% risk-free on my money because, like I said, there's nobody running around between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve with like wheelbarrows of cash. These are just people typing numbers into screens, and whether or not they've borrowed or whether or not they've taxed doesn't affect their ability to type those numbers into screens. I want to listen to what you said again, because there was something else I wanted to criticize.
Interest rates. In recent years, interest rates have been very low. That tends to make it easier to borrow and to sustain that borrowing. Where we are now...
Yeah, again, this sounds intuitive, what he's saying, but the empirical evidence shows that typically when the interest rates go up, there's more borrowing, and when they go down, there's less. And furthermore, higher interest rates. Oh yeah, this is what I wanted to say. The idea, the classically accepted idea, is that when the government needs to borrow, it raises the interest rates in order to attract people to bring in their cash, and because they'll pay out a greater interest rate, right? And then that in and of itself is supposed to slow down inflation because people aren't borrowing and creating as much money through the banking system. Now, I already addressed the latter thing, as it doesn't actually slow it down. But second of all, because the government it doesn't need to borrow in order to spend, it's just a complete fallacy, just not valid. Just doesn't happen that the government needs to raise these interest rates in order to attract money, in order to borrow it to spend it. However, if the Federal Reserve, if Congress, if the population thinks it is, it's going to keep chasing this thing backwards and not keep providing solutions that don't fix a problem because the problem doesn't exist the way they think it does.
Doesn't make me, as of now, very nervous.
I worry about the debt a lot more than he does.
While all countries take on debt, only these two have debt ceilings.
Oh, I was wrong.
However,
Okay, Denmark has a debt ceiling.
So high, they're not going to come close to hitting it.
Okay.
Unlike the United States, where the government...
If Denmark has a debt ceiling so high that they're not going to come close to hitting it, that's essentially not having a debt ceiling.
Is constantly having to raise the debt ceiling to pay for spending they already approved.
That's the big problem with the debt limit, is it's internally contradictory. The government passes a law that says you have to spend 10. It passes a law saying you can only collect 8 in taxes. And then it passes another law saying you're not allowed to borrow 2.
If the U.S. does hit the debt ceiling, it would mean...
Again, emphasis. All of that is entirely political decisions. Nothing to do with the economy.
The Treasury couldn't issue any more bonds, so no more debt revenue. Taxes would still be coming in, but that's not enough to cover all these responsibilities. So maybe they stop paying federal employees or stop spending money for programs. But at some point, they won't be able to pay the interest to these investors or cash out.
Okay, false. Well, I guess they wouldn't be if they made the arbitrary decision not to. But this idea that, we won't be able to pay the investors, we'll be able to make good on our debt. It's just a political decision.
Social Security bonds. That's called a default. It's never happened. Yet.
You couldn't do more to sabotage your financial system than default.
Interest rates could rise based on a reassessment that the United States was considerably riskier than people.
Yeah, okay, I mean, this is complete nonsense. So first, giving the United States a credit rating is bunk. But this idea that interest rates would go up if the United States had a lower credit rating, the United States sets the interest rate as a political decision. There is nothing to do with the market that sets those interest rates. It's the board of the Federal Reserve, who are all picked by, move my hands this way because you'll see them, that are all picked by Congress and the president making governmental choices. Now, if they're looking at this and they believe this and they say, because our credit rating went down, we need to raise the interest rate. Well, then I guess in that case, there's a connection. But that's only because they believe this. It's entirely arbitrary what they pick, and it's a political decision when they do it. Nothing to do with the market.
People had thought before. When government bond interest rates go up, that usually means that other interest rates are going up.
I don't know if he meant that in that order, but if he did, it's wrong. It's not that other interest rates go up, therefore the government interest rates go up. It's that the government interest rates go up, therefore the other interest rates go up. Because banks make their money off of arbitrage. And if they need to borrow from the Federal Reserve System at a higher interest rate, well, they need to charge a higher interest rate when they give you a loan. And furthermore, and probably more importantly, if the interest sets like the floor for the interbank lending market. So it's, or actually no, I'm saying it the wrong way. Let's say the federal government is paying 3% interest. Now, I go to a bank, and that bank is going, well, we could invest in this risk-free money at 3% interest, or we can loan to you for 3% interest at a risk. Well, what's it going to do? Risk-free money or you with the risk? Well, in order to take you as a risk, it's got to be greater than the risk-free money. So when the government raises or lowers the interest rate, that controls, for example, the mortgages, not the other way around.
If you borrow for anything, whether it's for a dishwasher, a car, college, or your credit card, that's going to become more costly. We're going to lose jobs. Wages won't go up as high.
Did she just connect that if we have more national debt, that the interest rates on cars and dishwashers and stuff will go up? Again, just none of these things are not connected as described here.
It could be like these countries and just not have a debt limit.
It could.
Or have one so high it's never a threat to the economy. Because if Congress and the president really want to take on less debt, they can change the tax system or reduce spending.
The debt limit does make sense.
And I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier, is that I think at some level, the people in Congress either understand this or quasi-understand this, and that the main reason to have a debt limit is so the party that's not in power has the ability to put pressure on the party that is in power. I would say similar to the filibuster. In the Senate, you need 51 votes in order to pass something, but it's 60 or 61 votes in order to overcome a filibuster, right? If you've got enough support in the Senate to pass it at 51, but the opposing party decides to do a filibuster and you can't get it passed, that's a reason to have to go to the other party and you got to find 10 more votes. I guess 5 more because you got 5 going down and 5 going up. But when it comes to getting rid of the filibuster, this actually happened after Biden came into office in 2021, is that there was this talk because we had a fully blue House, Senate, and presidency, is should we get rid of the filibuster so there would be less of a breaks of the Democrats being able to pass through what they wanted to pass through. And there were several prominent Democrats that opposed it because they said, hey, at some point, this is going to flip. And then we're going to be in a situation where the Republicans can ram stuff through and we won't be able to filibuster. So no. And I actually credit them for that because I think that's a good idea. I think the debt ceiling, the fact that we continue to have this debt ceiling where it's this, we're always bumping into it this close. I think that's another version of the filibuster. It's just a way for the minority party to put pressure on the majority party, and the majority party won't get rid of it because they know at some point in the future they might be the minority party, and they want the tool themselves.
If you are a functioning Congress, you're saying we need to put in place some policy to make sure that we don't borrow more than we mean to, or we stop and we pause and we check.
They don't borrow.
Borrowing.
There is no borrowing.
That certainly isn't how it is working.
And the simplest thing would just be to repeal it and be like almost every other country in the world.
Even if the U.S. never actually defaults on its debt, just the mere political fights and will they or won't they unease could make the United States a less desirable place to invest.
It's long.
Again, remember the part where they brought up the Federal Reserve owning, in quotes, a certain amount of the debt? We don't need anybody to invest in the United States. Excuse me. Unfortunately, and it doesn't need to be set up this way, there's this whole thing about the Treasury can't create reserves, it can only create Treasury bonds, and the Federal Reserve has the authority to create those reserves, and they have to interact with each other in a certain dorky way where the United States Treasury has to, in quotes, sell the reserves, or excuse me, sell the bonds in order to get the reserves. The Federal Reserve is always there to buy them. The Federal Reserve is always there to buy them, in quotes, buy them. We don't need China. We don't need Social Security. We don't need Japan. We don't need private companies, in quotes, buying this debt. The Federal Reserve is always there because this is a money creation action. It's not a market action of, people investing in something or not. So on one hand, there is some truth to this because the constant fighting over the debt actually, makes people it makes people uncertain. And part of the reason when I'm making this video is because you don't have to be uncertain. Even when they fight about it, even if it looks like there's going to be an arbitrary decision that they're not going to do it, I don't think that's ever going to happen because fundamentally, what I think it is, it's like the filibuster. Whenever the Republicans, and I'm sure Democrats will do it if the Democrats get minority, whenever they all walk off or whenever they filibuster about the debt, oh my God, the national debt, what they're doing is they're trying to eat up time from the other side so they don't have enough time to argue about such. They can kill bills by not having enough time to talk about those bills, right? They're never going to not come to the table after the fact and pass the legislation for the basic on-the-bus spending. You see what I'm saying? At a fundamental level, they know that spending has to happen and that it's all a big show. And if you understand it's a big show, you can stop worrying about this crap. It's a fake issue.
Been seen as this is kind of the safest asset that you can invest in. And so
it's correct.
Given the U.S. a lot of advantages. But the more our political system is so polarized and dysfunctional, the more that it becomes a little bit questioned of whether the U.S. should have the incredible advantage that it has thus far.
Not about the stupid credit report, but that's the end. Yes, to reiterate, the national debt is not a real issue. It's fake, and it's there to help control you and help you fight with your neighbor about an issue that doesn't actually exist. The way money is created is it gets spent to existence by the federal government and it gets taxed out later. The federal government has to leave a little bit in there in order for it to, for the private sector to have any money to work with, and that it's got this system where. And this might be an anachronism, and to talk about that in another video. This might be an anachronism back when there was the gold standard where there was actually a real limit to the amount of gold, and the government came in and said, hey, look, we'll pay you an interest rate if you buy treasuries with your reserves instead of gold. in order to attract people to aim them at the treasuries as opposed to aiming them at the gold, which is a real limited resource. It might be left over from that the idea that the United States Treasury has to, in quotes, sell the bonds in order to get the reserves, and that the Federal Reserve acts as the I should say the gap insurance for whatever the government needs to raise that other people don't buy. That may be anachronistic, but when you look at it as a whole picture, this whole rigmarole going back and forth between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and say, okay, this is just the federal government operating internally, then all it is they're both money. One pays an interest rate and the other one doesn't, and you can stop freaking out about the U.S. debt.